Do we? All right. So hello, Internet. Thank you all for coming out this evening to our forest learning series. We are building off of a series that we started last spring of 2018. Different situation. Spring of 2018, we had been struggling with any sort of precipitation happening in the San Juan National Forest and anywhere. Any of you who were skiers, we were all struggling. We didn't see any monsoons in 2017, and we were setting up for a very dry season. And we really wanted to start launching a conversation about what does that mean for our communities and how do we prepare for a dry season or a dry year coming forward. 2019, winter 2018, 2019, very different scenario. 200% of snowpack. The Animas River with the fear of pushing flood levels. And so we kind of entered into this year feeling a little bit more relaxed. I think if you look at Mike and I were talking today a bit about where did we end up on the spectrum for precipitation for our area, and does anybody think we hit 100% of the precipitation for the year to date, given all that snow we had last year? So thinking through the whole year from January to now, are we 100%? Not at all. So we keep rolling out of a big winter, but we've gotten no real precipitation or monsoon season since. So we just don't know what we're going to face from any time. So our fire learning series is really, hopefully, a way to this year to start thinking about not only what are we facing currently, but how do we get our communities prepared for those scenarios where we don't have the conditions that are going to keep us healthy, safe, secure. This is the first of a series of 3. Starting, so Wednesday night, tonight is the 23rd, right? Yes. Shoo. Okay. We'll do another one on the 30th and then one on the 6th. Tonight we'll be talking a bit about forests, the role it's played on the landscape historically and what we're looking at and how that's influenced some of our planning. And then over the next series, we'll kind of get a little bit more information. We'll wrap it up on the 6th. And start really thinking about what do our communities need to do to think about how we live with fire going into the future. Sound like a fun series? Yes. We have great speakers. Tonight we'll have 2 speakers, and then we'll set up a panel discussion with 3 folks who are actually either researching or applying research and information to work on the ground. So we'll go that way. And then we'll take a 10-minute break, and we'll bring everybody back together. I do need to make sure that I thank our sponsors for this evening. I want to thank San Juan Citizens Alliance, always for their involvement, Colorado State Forest Service, always for their support, for the Southern Rockies Fire Science Network, who's been a supporter over the years. Who am I missing, Emily? Powerhouse. We got to thank the Powerhouse. I did say, oh yes, and thank you, Wildfire Adaptive Partnership, formerly Firewise, right? So, yeah, newly upgraded, fresh paint job, Wildfire Adaptive Partnership.
Southern Rocky Fire Science Network.
Yes, got them.
Yep, U.S. Forest Service.
The United States Forest Service, thank you.
San Juan National Forest.
San Juan National Forest.
So Mountain Studies Institute.
And Mountain Studies Institute. My name is Aaron Kimball, which now you know. You've heard me talking for 2 minutes now, 5 minutes, and I'm Aaron Kimball. I'm the Director of Forest Programs at Mountain Studies Institute. This very bright woman here in the corner who has been filling us in on the sponsors is Emily. She had pulled all this together in partnership with Michael Remke, Dr. Michael Remke with Mountain Studies Institute, and Anthony Culpepper, all were in the forest program. So thank you to all of that crew. We do have a sign-in sheet at each door. We love to just document how many people attended, and we also will have an evaluation form that we'll make available And that way, we can learn about our events and see what we can do better going forward into the future. With all of that, it's time for me to get out of here and bring in the speakers that we have who are really good. We're going to bring up Dr. Michael Remke. He works in Mountain Studies Institute. We hired him on as our associate research. What do we call you?
Research associate?
Research associate. And we're very strict about naming folks and giving them job titles at Mountain Studies. But Mike he's a product of Fort Lewis College, went to NAU and Flagstaff, has been researching soil, forest health, and has carried forward a lot of our initiatives with the 416 fire this past year, been helping us to monitor all our programs from all the way from Pagosa all the way to Dolores. And we really appreciate having Mike on staff and making himself available tonight. So without further ado, Dr. Michael Remke.
Well, awesome. I'm super excited to see all of you out to talk forests and talk forest ecology. It's great to get everyone in the room. And again, just reiterate the thanks to our sponsors and thanks to Emily for getting us all set up. So I'm going to try to give us a foundation in forest ecology and the role fire plays in our different forests here on the San Juan in 30 minutes or less. So hopefully I can do this in a way that's engaging, shows some of the complexities of these ecosystems, and helps us understand some of the complexities of how fire behaves in our ecosystems. So this talk outline, I'm going to start just by introducing our forest types, and then I'm going to return to each of our forest types to briefly describe how they interact with fire. And then I'm going to shift gears a little bit and try to frame the perspective of what it means to be a resilient community and what it means to be a community that lives with fire. And then I'll hand off the microphone, so to speak, to our Forest Service partner who's going to focus in on a specific subset of some of these forest types.
Is everybody still hearing it? Microphone needed? All right.
People in the back can hear fine? Sweet. Okay, so it's something I just also want to reiterate before I dive too far into this. I'm going to use the 416 fire as kind of a textbook example for a lot of the points that I talk about, but I don't want to just talk about the 416 fire. I want to use this to give us a foundational framework for how we think about forests in our general geography, right? So let's start by simply defining our forest types. So the cool thing about Durango and why a lot of us live here is this awesome elevational gradient that we have, right? So with that elevational gradient, that just disappeared.
You broke it, Mike.
It turned off. So there's no forest in
Here's the forest type.
Big snowstorm.
It's a blackout.
What just happened?
Flashing orange light.
Flashing orange, yes. I'm gonna need this off. Just give me a second. Think about it.
Yeah, I was going to say this.
He's got that dance move down better than me, so I don't know.
That's bad. That was bad.
Just give it 1 second here.
So like I'm sleeping or something.
Oh, you know what turned on when you were. But.
Because Mike was presenting.
I've been once before, but then it turned back on. It just needed a second to think about it. Question.
Oh, green.
Green.
Oh, we got green.
It's green.
It's good. I was just about to start doing goofy stuff.
It's good.
Green is good.
Oh. Oh, there's lights, solid green.
Now we're rolling. There we go.
Yeah.
Maybe these lights up and those lights up.
You want me to turn those lights on?
Yeah. Let's just, if it gets too dark.
I can turn on these two lights too.
That would be great.
That'd be good.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
Okay, we've restored our forest. Restoration works. Cool. So if we start at the lower end of our elevation gradient, we have San Juans with our forested ecosystems. We have Pinyon-Juniper woodlands, right? Pinyon-Juniper. As we move up, we move into our Ponderosa Pine ecosystems. Up further, we move into what we call Mixed-Conifer. And I use that term because I want us to become more familiar with it. But xeric is just a fancy word for warm and dry. Further up the slope, we move into Mesic, which is just a fancy word for cool, moist Mixed-Conifer. And then somewhere in the mix, we have our beautiful Aspen forests that still are holding on to wonderful golden leaves. And then finally, at the top of this gradient, we end up with the spruce fir forest before we move into the alpine, right? So if we kind of come all the way back to what that looks like across the slope, we have all of these different forests with not necessarily distinct boundaries between them, right? So there's places where there's some junipers that kind of mix with the pines, pines that mix with some of these other mixed conifer forests. So you might be thinking, well, how do we define some of those? And I just want to introduce this concept of these boundary areas where we see a lot of species co-mixing together, are something that in ecology we call an ecotone, right? So these are areas that have heightened diversity because there's not a distinct hard boundary between different forest types. Just so that we're familiar and we understand that these aren't hard lines on the landscape. Okay, so this map takes those forest types and plots them in the San Juan Mountains with the boundary of the San Juan National Forest. And if we look at where Durango is, we have shades of light blue to dark red that represent where our homes are. And then we have these colors ranging from kind of brownish to represent Pinyon-Juniper, going all the way up through the Ponderosa Pine, through the Mixed-Conifer Forests, and all the way up into these purple spruce fir forests. And as an example, wow, this is turning into a strobe light. And as an example, if we look at the La Platas, after the spruce fir, we have our high alpine zone, right? So we can see this elevational gradient with these different forest types across our landscape. The other thing I put on this map just for us to think about is our wilderness boundaries here in the hashed blue, and most of our wilderness encompasses that spruce fir forest type. Just something to note as we talk about this moving forward. So we can think about each of these forest types and how they interact with fire, with how often fire might occur in these landscapes. And so this map is a layer that was derived by the San Juan National Forest to think about fire return. Fire return is how often fire returns to a landscape after it has started. So when we look at these brown colors, these are colors that represent the 6 to 20 year range. And as we transition into yellows, we're looking at 20 to 30 years, all the way up to the blues, where fire returns to a landscape every 200 to 751 years. Generally, our low elevation forests, which unfortunately this ends at the San Juan National Forest boundary, but these low elevation forests have fire that occurs more frequently. And as we move higher into the mountains, fire occurs less and less frequently, right? With one exception. Any guesses as to what that exception might be? Oh, not necessarily, but that is something to consider for sure.
The suggestion was human caused.
So human-caused fires certainly can alter how frequently fire occurs on our landscape. But what I was thinking about is Pinyon-Juniper. So here's some blues in low elevation forests near Bayfield. And this is our Pinyon-Juniper landscape. Pinyon-Juniper don't actually burn that often. So that's one exception where we have a low elevation forest that does not burn at the same level of frequency as some of our other low elevation forests, right? So let's talk about Pinyon-Juniper. Pinyon-Juniper is maybe not everybody's favorite forest type, but we are surrounded by a lot of it, right? And there's a couple different types of Pinyon-Juniper forests. Some take on more of this savanna look where you have large spaces in between trees. Others take on more of this densely tight, closed forest type that's more of like a woodland. right? So we can have relatively sparse tree cover all the way to dense tree cover. And often, if we start a fire in a Pinyon-Juniper forest, and we think about this triangle, which is known as the fire behavior triangle, where we can think about fuels, weather, and topography, this forest type has a lack of continuous fuels. So often, fire burns a single tree where that fire started and is put out because there's nowhere else for that fire to burn. But sometimes Pinyon-Juniper forests experience lots of wind and it can be quite dry, and we end up with a fire that looks much more like this. These forests, when fires get going in them, burn really hot and really fast. These are the types of fires that in Northern California, Northeastern California, in Eastern Oregon, burn very large acreage in very few days. Luckily, here in Southwest Colorado, we haven't seen much of this type of fire, but this type of fire certainly can happen in dry years with the right weather. Okay, so something else that I want to point out, and the colors on this projector aren't great, but fire is not the only thing impacting our Pinyon-Juniper landscape. So this is a green juniper tree, another green juniper tree, and then we have dead pinyon trees. All three of the pinions in this forest, or in this photo, are dead from drought. So this is an area that's being impacted quite drastically from drought, and we're seeing that on the landscape across the Southwest. Okay, moving up into Ponderosa Pine. So Ponderosa Pine is this beautiful tree that most of us are very familiar with because we happen to live in Ponderosa Pine. And Ponderosa has a lot of different traits to it. It can be open and park-like, like the picture I just showed you, or it can be more complex with multiple aged trees, like this picture here. And another key component here is Ponderosa Pine often has gamble oak in its understory, especially here in Southwest Colorado, often grass understory as well, so there's a lot more complexity here in Ponderosa Pine. And when we think about fire in Ponderosa Pine, I want to introduce another really quick fire triangle. This is the fire, what you need to start a fire. So oxygen, heat, and fuel. So in a Ponderosa Pine forest, well, of course you have oxygen, you're outside. You have fuel, you have trees, and then you can add some sort of heat source, any sort of ignition. Like lightning, as an example. Lightning certainly strikes in the Ponderosa Pine zone, they can start a fire, and then we can come back to think about our fire behavior triangle. So thinking about weather, topography, and fuels, Ponderosa Pine often has a continuous grass understory that allows fire to creep along the surface, burning grass, burning some of those gamble oak shrubs, and moving about as a surface fire. This is something that happens with general frequency every 6 to 30 years, as that map I showed you earlier depicts. And it's something that's normally a very low severity surface fire. So what that looks like in terms of fire behavior is something like this, where we see the grass burning, we see some of these shrubs burning, but there's no flames shooting up the sides of these trees, right? So very calm fire behavior. And after a fire, this is on the 416 fire, we see maybe some brown needles and some char on the bases of the trees, but it generally actually doesn't look like a fire happened as quickly as a year ago in this photo, right? So this is a frequent low severity fire. But if we change, say, the weather on this fire behavior triangle and increase the winds, we can start to increase fire behavior where now we have flames getting up into the canopy of these trees. We're consuming much more of the smaller oaks in this understory, and the fire is behaving more like something like this. And so this is not exactly a high severity fire, but it's certainly burning with more heat. We have flames now creeping up the sides of the trees and up into the upper canopies, right? So again, on the 416 fire, now we see higher char marks on these trees, and we see brown needles going much further up these trees, but we don't necessarily see entire trees dying. Now, that fire might continue to creep about when fuels are low and maybe the weather's calmed down, but as we start to manipulate the fuels available, and maybe move into some of those more diverse and complex Ponderosa Pine forests, we again start to see fire behavior increase and consume more, sometimes entire trees, and get all the way up into the canopy of trees. This could be the form of individual tree torching, or this could be the form of multiple tree canopies catching on fire in what's called a crown fire. So just by changing the available fuel, or the weather, or both, we can change fire behavior in Ponderosa Pine. Again, from the 416 fire, now we have trees that are completely blackened, we have trees that are mostly scorched, but we still have some trees that actually have green needles, and some trees that have a little bit of scorch on the bottom, and the understory was pretty well burnt over. So multiple different types of fire behavior based off of weather, fuels, and overall conditions. Now we can also manipulate topography. Take that same Ponderosa Pine forest, put it on a steep slope. Remember, this tree here is where our fire started, but now being on a steeper slope, we've increased fire behavior across the whole forest. And we even have examples of fire now backing down slope. Embers may be rolling downhill, right? So topography is also something really important to consider when we consider how fires interact with our forests. Okay, moving upslope, we get into warm, dry, mixed conifer forests. These aren't all that different than Ponderosa Pine, in that Ponderosa Pine is still a dominant tree species, but now we also have Douglas firs moving into the forest, and maybe a more complex understory. Right? So what this might look like is a Ponderosa Pine forest with Douglas fir in the mix as well, maybe some white firs in the understory, and overall a more complex forest structure. So this now, if we think about fuels, has a greater tree density and therefore also more fuels. So if we introduce fire to this, we've manipulated the fuels that are available regardless of fire weather or topography, and we end up seeing fires that tend to have this mixed severity that leaves trees sort of blackened with maybe some green canopy, maybe entire trees torching, and the understory certainly burning quite thoroughly. So again, to come back to the 416 fire, here's an example of what the 416 fire did in warm, dry, mixed conifer. We see brown and scorched needles. We see many trees that torched entirely, and then in the background here, we still see some green trees and the understory burning pretty well over. Moving upslope further yet, we get into the mixed conifer, and I don't want to spend too much time on these wetter forest types because Matt's going to focus a lot of his talk on these forest types. But again, we have Douglas fir components in these forests, except for now we're adding in some aspen and other species diversity, right? So we have our white firs, we have Douglas firs, we might see some blue spruce, certainly see some aspen, there might be some snags. So overall, we're getting into a much more diverse forest type. Now, a big limiting factor for fire in these systems is, well, they're called cool, wet, mixed conifer forests, right? So these are forests that generally have quite a bit more moisture than the warm, dry, and the Ponderosa Pine forests. So if we try to start a fire, if we had a lightning strike in here, one tree might burn, but that fire is going to be put out by the available moisture in the system, right? So to start a fire in this system, we need it to dry out first. And this is something that really only happens historically every 50 to 100 years in these forest types. So if we remove the rain, and we have the right conditions, a really dry year, last year as being a great example, we can again get a fire that spreads through this forest system. We now have a pretty high fuel load, so again, we're looking at these mixed severity types of fires. So what that might look like after the fire is quite similar to what I just showed you, where we have some trees that remain green at the top, they're scorched at the bottom, the understory is totally burnt over, but our aspen component responds really positively to fire, right? So we introduce this disturbance, aspen can sprout, so we end up with tons of little aspens. And again, to come back to the 416 fire, this is a cool, moist, mixed conifer forest that burned in relatively mixed severity, but closer to high severity. So we see a lot of these trees are blackened all the way to the top, and these are all aspens starting to come back in following that fire. You can see there are some white stems in here, which were the aspens that existed in this forested landscape before the fire. Okay, so let's talk about aspen for a quick second. Aspen's a pretty prevalent piece of our forested landscape. Indeed, a lot of people come to Southwest Colorado to enjoy the fall scenery when aspen changes. So it exists in previous disturbance patches. It loves, whether it's fire, avalanche, any disturbance on the landscape, aspen tends to sprout and pop up after. So we call this an early successional species. It often paves the way for some of these more late successional conifer species. Part of what makes it a great early successional species is it's prone to lots of diseases. So when aspen starts to get old, it's got a lot of different fungal rots in it, and those fungal rots start to kill off the aspen. As the aspen starts to die, the conifers that are in the understory of the aspen become the new dominant species and are released given all that light, right? So as an example, there was the Lime Creek fire in 1879 off of Mullis Pass. You've probably driven by the sign. There's a plaque that marks where that fire was. And if you spend some time looking at that landscape, well, there's a lot of aspen there. And that aspen ends up looking like a mosaic of a wildfire across that landscape. So where the conifers are is where the fire didn't burn, and then where the aspen is where that fire burned relative hotness. So we can see the landscape, the residual effects on the landscape of a fire that happened in 1879 simply by looking at aspen, right? So this is pretty cool. The Lime Creek fire in 1879 was also one of the first significant named fires in the Southwest, right? So this is a historical event that has certainly altered the landscape today. Okay, so now at the top of our elevation, we have our spruce fir zone, which has a terrific understory, and I absolutely love being in spruce fir when that understory turns red. And this zone is maybe famous for where we like to ski, right? So this is a forest type that gets a ton of snow. Again, a really wet forest type. So general characteristics, this is dominated by subalpine fir and Engelmann spruce, our two most common species up here. Very wet, lots of snow, lots of rain. This moisture limits the ability to fire, for fire to both start and spread in our forests. But much like I just mentioned with wet Mixed-Conifer, if we have a dry year, we can indeed ignite a fire and it can spread rapidly to these forests. So this is generally a stand replacing fire that kills all of the dominant overstory trees every 100 to 700 years. An example of this would be the West Fork fire, right? And moisture, and it's the biggest thing that limits fire in this ecosystem, right? So we need these drought years in order for a fire to actually start to spread in its forest type. Here's again an example of a spruce fir fire. It looks relatively similar to the Mesic Mixed-Conifer. This is up on Big Lick Creek on the 416 fire. So something else that I just want to spend a little bit of time for us to think about, something else that we are observing a lot in our spruce fir zone is relatively high amounts of spruce bark beetle mortality, right? Wolf Creek Pass, we've seen these trees turn gray and turn brown from the beetle mortality. And a lot of us tend to look at that and say, wow, that looks like it's just ready to go. That's ready to ignite and burn. Well, so these trees die, and the forest ends up looking something more like this. But fire behaves almost the exact same way in these spruce beetle killed forests as it does in the green needle forests of the spruce fir zone. Again, because it's such a wet forest type, even for the standing dead trees to be dry enough to burn, it has to be really dry, like really dry. So the fire isn't necessarily that altered by beetle mortality. There is some complexity here that's maybe worth talking about in the panel discussion, but this is something to note, that this isn't necessarily a tinderbox just because the trees are dead. It's still the same type of system. Okay, so one more picture to think about fire in our forested types on the 416 fire, right? And this is what fire ecologists call the mosaic, right? So when we look at this landscape, we see areas of green, we see areas of burnt aspen, we see areas of burnt trees with bare soil, areas of burnt trees with regenerating soil, and then everything in between, right? So this mosaic is patches of low, moderate, and high severity where fire moved across the landscape based off of fuels, weather, and topography to leave this mosaic behind. This is generally how we hope to see fire behave in our forested systems, responding to the conditions on the ground to create something more or less like this. So what happens after fire? Well, come back next week, and Julie Korb, Andy Gleason, and Scott Roberts are all going to talk about post-fire dynamics, from erosion and mudslides on Missionary Ridge fire to regeneration on the 416 fire and aquatic and ecosystem health on the 416 fire. So next week will kind of be the follow-up of what happens after fire. But one last thing that's worth thinking about is communities in fire, right? So again, the 416 fire was in our backyard. Many people make this drive every day, whether it's to recreate or to go to their homes. And this is the scene that we had during that fire. So when we think about community resilience to fire, we still need to think about the fire triangle, and we can see our house as fuel for a fire, right? So one thing that we can do to prepare our homes for fire is to put metal roofing on our homes, put screens beneath our roofs and behind vents on our structures so that embers don't get in, and then also make sure we don't have exposed flammables. So we're flame-proofing, we're removing fuel from our homes. So we also think about defensible space around our structures. So if you go visit our partners at Wildfire Adapted and think about what does defensible space mean, you'll see something along the lines of a zone 1 around your house where you remove all of the fields and all of the continuous fields around your house, a zone 2 where you thin trees and shrubs and help break up some of that field, and then a zone 3 where you're really trying to improve forest health and break up some of those fields so that as fire moves across these landscapes, it slows down as it gets closer to your home, and firefighters have a safe place to actually protect your home from. So this is a great concept to think about how we as homeowners can be a little more prepared for fire. And if we think about all of our homeowners in a community doing this, we start to see that these zones start to overlap amongst one another. And my protections help protect my neighbor's home, and we can actually build a community that's relatively protected, right? But that's not always going to help, right? If we have extreme fire behavior, this is a photo from the campfire, and virtually every single home is destroyed in this photograph, except for maybe some remnants here and there. So other things that we as communities can do is think about emergency preparedness, right? If you live in a tsunami zone, you know the tsunami evacuation route. It's often signed. So I would encourage us to think about what are our known evacuation routes prior to having to use them because of a fire. That way, when there's a fire, you know what to do. You don't need to wait for someone to tell you. The other thing a homeowner can do is have a box of valuables and important documents that's just ready to go. That way you're not scrambling at your house to try to find the things you need. You just pick up the box, you put it in your car, and you use the known evacuation route, and you're gone, right? So we still need to think about being prepared for the worst case scenario, even though we can do other things to help prevent. So what happens also if we think about expanding the work that we do around our homes to making it the work that we do around our communities? So in this idea, I've put a buffer around our highly dense housing areas for all of our communities here in the San Juan, calling that buffer zone 1, analogous to the defensible space zones. And then I put a buffer around that, call that defensible space 2, and then another buffer around that. So analogous to what I already showed you with the homes, but on a community level. And again, we start, what Durango does to protect Durango protects Mancos. What Mancos does helps protect Cortez. So a community-wide effort to prepare ourselves for fire. What this might look like is maybe thinning the forest right around our communities in this buffer zone 2 to help remove some of those fuel loads and help reduce the fire behavior when the fire gets close to our communities. And perhaps using fire as a tool, prescribed fire as a tool, a little bit further out from our communities to also help reduce fuels in a more economical way across a large landscape. So really just food for thought, right? And in my last couple minutes, I do want to just throw the elephant in the room up here and think about climate change and what that means for our forests, right? So I already mentioned that the Spruce Beetle outbreaks are pretty large with widespread tree mortality And I think there's a lot of interesting questions of if this is unprecedented or if this is some sort of historical disturbance that we just now have the right climate for, or if human interactions with our atmosphere are actually exacerbating climate processes that are favoring these types of outbreaks. We just don't have great answers for if this level of disturbance is historical or not. And it begs a really interesting question. Furthermore, smoky skies might become more of the norm if we think about a warmer and drier world. We might see more favorable fire weather days than we currently see as a result of something like climate change. So I'm really just putting this out here for food for thought. I'm not here to tell you answers to what climate change is going to do. There is some science, there's some models, there's things that we can talk about, but it's an interesting thing to think about, especially as a community that lives in these fire-prone forests. So I think we're holding off on all questions until the panel discussion. So let me prep. Oh, and if anyone's interested, I do have a large body of literature of science that's been done in the San Juans, from people like Julie Korb at Fort Lewis, to people like Bill Rami, who used to be at Fort Lewis, to community members like Bill Baker, who have now retired here, and the list continues on and on. So lots of great people have been doing science here on the San Juan to help us understand our forested ecosystems. And I can easily make these publications available if people are interested. So let me prep Matt's talk, and we'll move off into the weather forests.
And we are going to make sure that we get all questions when we get the panel up there, and you can grill the heck out of these guys. So keep them written down. Don't lose those. Yeah, we changed. So our other talker tonight is Matt Tuten. He's forester over there on the Pagosa Ranger District. And speaker, a phenomenal speaker, Matt Tuten.
Hey guys, thanks for coming out tonight. It's great to talk with a group of folks who are interested in what's going on in the woods. Don't always have this opportunity to just talk about what's going on and why we're doing it. This is a great opportunity to do that. I'm a silviculturist and a forester. I manage a timber program on the National Forest from Durango to Pagosa Springs. So much of what you're going to hear from me tonight focuses on that portion of the San Juan. I don't really work directly on the Dolores district to the west here. So getting started here. So you're out there in the forest. See this truck out there, see some fire on the ground, looks like he's putting out some fire. You're wondering, okay, what's going on? He's putting out a fire. And then you're like, oh, we got the fire out. Next day, you see this. You're like, what's going on? I thought he just put that fire out. You planned a bike ride because you thought the fire was out, right? And you see this the next day. Or let's say it's winter, you're up at Wolf Creek, and you're looking off the chairlift at a landscape of gray dead trees. And a question I hear all the time is, what's the Forest Service doing about all these dead trees? Or let's say you're stuck behind one of these trucks on the road. You might actually see these coming through Durango nowadays, heading over the mountains. You're wondering, where'd those come from? And what are we doing with those? And how come when I go to Home Depot, nothing's ever from Colorado? And so these are just a bunch of questions I hear from the public in my job. And really what I want to do today is just talk a little bit about what we're doing out on the ground in managing vegetation on the National Forest, and then why we're doing it. And kind of connect back some of what we're doing to what Mike just talked about in the different forest types. So here's something we don't talk about a whole lot because it's essentially a 400-page PDF document that isn't really exciting. But this is San Juan Forest Plan. So this is a document that is the foundation for everything we do out on the ground. This was developed through a big collaborative process back in 2010. Starting in 2010, it was signed in 2013. Every national forest in the country needs to have one of these to guide what it does on the ground. And so a lot of what we're doing, everything we're doing, is really guided by this document. and informed by public interaction during the crafting of this document. If you've been around for a while, you may remember meetings back in that time frame going over the forest plan. One thing this document does, this is kind of looking familiar to what Mike had up there. What this does is it tells us how to manage these different forest types. And one thing that it does is it describes the current condition on the ground, and then it also describes the desired condition that we want to move towards. That desired condition is informed by science on the historic range of variability, or what these forests were like naturally. And then the difference between that current condition, let's say in a pine forest, which is pretty dense, and the desired condition, which is much more open stand, that's what the forest plan informs. So it tells us how many acres we want to manage for what reasons. So this document, available online if you want to download 40 megabytes PDF, guides everything we're doing in terms of objectives for different forest types. The other thing it does is it lays out some broad distinctions for management across the landscape. One of the most fundamental ones that guides what we do are these protected areas. A cool thing about the San Juan National Forest is that we have a huge portion of the landscape that's protected. This is not the case in every forest. Mike pointed out we have wilderness at the highest elevations in the spruce fir. We also have quite a bit of roadless areas. So these are areas with no roads. Roads were never built in these areas. They're fairly rugged. And we don't really do much active management aside from fire management in these areas because they're remote and inaccessible. And then we also have these things like the Piedra area, which is something that's kind of managed like a wilderness, but has a different legal designation. And the cool thing about that is that that's montane forest. Most wilderness in Colorado is like the top of the mountain and is rock and ice. And in the San Juan, we actually have wilderness-like landscapes that are forested in Colorado. The other thing that the forest plan lays out is management areas. So this is sort of broad categories for what we're trying to accomplish out in the landscape. So in this map, the blue areas, and you actually can't see the distinction between two of the blues, these sort of like lighter blue areas in the sort of middle elevations, these are areas where we might do active management. This is where you might actually see thinning or some type of logging. Those areas in the wilderness, in the lighter blue up here higher, these are areas where natural processes totally dominate. We don't really do much in those areas. We don't put a lot of mechanized efforts into those landscapes. And then we also have special management areas like Chimney Rock National Monument, which is almost managed like a national park for different objectives. And then we have some areas that are highly developed near towns where fire management is constrained because we don't necessarily want fire in everybody's backyard. So we have a natural fire start and think differently about managing fire in those areas because they're so close to communities. So this kind of sets that landscape structure out for us, and then this is what really dictates why we might be doing something in any given part of the landscape. So given that sort of foundation, what are the issues that drive what we're doing on the forest? Biggest one, no surprise, people out in the landscape. So the most obvious one from this photo are homes, communities, people that live on the edge of the forest. We call it the wildland urban interface. When we do have fires in this landscape, these are areas where we're going to send firefighters to protect communities. And so proactively managing those areas to reduce those impacts, make it safer for firefighters, something we spend a lot of time doing. But we also spend a lot of thought thinking about the impacts of fire and active mechanized management to things like recreation, snowmobiling, hiking, mountain biking, smoke impacts to recreation. These are our big economic drivers here, and so almost everything we're doing has that as a consideration. Another no surprise here is the policy of fire suppression. As soon as Europeans showed up here, we started putting out fires. And if you're this guy back in the late 1800s, let's see, your cow and your horse eat grass that can burn up. Your town employs a lot of people in the sawmill. Your house is built out of wood, and you heat it with firewood. And so when you go see a fire, when you see a fire out in the woods, you ride your horse out there and you put it out. And folks did this right away, moving into the landscape, and it was effective. So some of these fires that started from lightning, nobody put them out historically. They could burn all summer. But as soon as Europeans showed up, we put them out immediately whenever they happened to the best of our ability. And our ability to do that increased over time. And now we're really effective at it. We have aircraft, all kinds of money being spent to manage fires in the national forests. And we need this because, as we saw in the 416 fire, there's going to be impacts to communities if we don't try to put out some fires certain times. But the downside or the effect of that is that these fires control tree regeneration historically across the landscape. And in our lowest elevation forests, like the Ponderosa Pine, putting out those fires led to big increases in small trees. Moving up in elevation to that Mixed-Conifer forest, fires weren't as frequent, but they did control some of the tree regeneration. And so in this policy of fire suppression, we've seen species that aren't adapting to fire move into those forest landscapes in mass. Species on the landscape would be like white fir or small Douglas fir. These are trees that get killed by fire, but aren't because we're putting out fires. You've got continuity, that leads to the fire situation. It's hard to overstate how much this drives what we're doing. In the Forest Service, half of our budget goes to managing emergency response to wildfires. Some of that's being addressed in our budget at high levels, but it shows you that this is driving a lot of what we spend money on because this is an emergency when you have fire like that coming towards the community. Another thing that drives what we do are the historical impacts of logging in this part of the world. We don't see it nowadays, but for 100 years, logging was like what people did in the Southern San Juan Mountains. See here, I mean, here's a train with a pretty elaborate trestle that was built around Pagosa Springs to take logs from Pagosa Springs, put them on a railroad, and ship them to Denver. We don't have any of that capacity anymore, but back in 1910, we actually had logs getting on railroads going to distant places. We had the biggest mill in Colorado in Pagosa Springs. In Dolores, they had a plywood plant. The problem with this is that it took most of the big trees out. We were more concerned with what was coming out than what we were leaving behind. And because of that, we left a lot of small trees. Sometimes we took trees that were desirable, like a Douglas fir tree, and left a tree that wasn't desirable, like a white fir, one that's flammable, and taking out the one that was resistant to fire. So we see that in a lot of our Mixed-Conifer forests, shift towards less fire-adaptive species as an effective management. Current demands for wood products also drives a little bit what we do. We don't see it a lot, but we do have a wood product economy here. Over in Dolores, we have a mill that uses aspen and dead pine to make paneling. We have a timber frame sort of cottage industry in this part of the world. A bunch of people that make houses that fit together, dry fit together with mortise and tenon joints and pegs. That's something you see a lot in the San Juans. We also ship logs across the mountain to Montrose, Colorado, where they make dimensional lumber. They primarily use dead spruce, and it's available even in Durango at Lumber here. And then this right up here, this is a shot of a stud that was torn out of our wall in Pagosa Springs during some remodeling this past winter. And looking at this, I was kind of surprised. It says ES, which means it's Engelmann spruce, and then it has this number 274. That's a mill stamp, so that tells you where that piece of wood was milled. That was actually milled in Pagosa Springs, and it was made its way into construction. That doesn't exist anymore. It hasn't existed since like 70s. But at one time, this stuff was making it into local buildings, and it's not really that long ago, in the 70s. That drives a little bit more. But the elephant in the room, so to speak, is really this changing climate that we have. Regardless of what we do in the near term with our emissions, we're looking at pretty significant increases in temperature in the Southwest. We kind of stand out for having big increases in temperature when you compare this region to the rest of it. Anywhere from a few degrees to almost 10 degrees over the next 100 years. Pretty big increase in temperature. So what does that mean? Well, obviously higher temperatures. It also means more rain versus snow. So in Durango, maybe you don't get snow anymore, it just rains. And then if it just rains, you don't have snowpack keeping in that moisture. So you basically have surface fuels and tree branches that are exposed to the wind for a much longer period, contributing to potential longer fire season. In this region, we have variability in precipitation. So it's not as simple as we're not going to get as much rain or we're going to get more rain. It's kind of like the last 2 years. 1 year is the worst drought we've had in decades, and the next year is the best snow year ever. And so that variability is something we're going to have to deal with in the future. And so the impacts of that: longer, more severe fire seasons, greater evaporative stress on vegetation, so they're going to have to deal with more drought conditions, more hotter temperatures that they have difficulty dealing with, increased insect activity like bark beetles. We'll talk about this in a second, and other types of insects. And then we could also be looking at shifts in forest types. So we can see areas that were once forests become shrublands, areas that were once pine forests become gamble oak forests, or Pinyon-Juniper forests. And so you don't have to use your imagination on this. This is Missionary Ridge Fire. We've got thousands of acres in that burn that aren't ever going to look like what they looked like prior to the burn, or at least in our lifetimes. And so we could be looking at more of that in the future. When it comes to insects, one thing that affects our forests dramatically is this western spruce budworm. It's a caterpillar that feeds on the tops of trees. This caterpillar turns into a moth, goes lay its eggs at the top of trees, feeds on the top of trees, stresses out the trees. A drier, warmer climate is going to result in more survival of this insect over time and lead to more defoliation, which impacts bark beetles. So right now we have at least 3 pretty significant bark beetle events going on. We have Douglas Fir Beetle in the Douglas Fir Forest and those Mixed-Conifer Forests. This beetle's taken out some of the oldest trees in our forests. You don't hear a lot about this one because these trees are scattered. And they don't create big patches of dead trees like we have here in the Dolores district. This is actually a Ponderosa Pine beetle. So these guys are looking at mortality at the scale of tens of thousands of acres now. We haven't seen that in Dolores or in Durango and Pagosa, and hopefully that doesn't happen, but this could almost lead to some type conversions, move forest to grassland over in Dolores. And then the one that everyone's familiar with is the spruce beetle, and we're seeing that up at higher elevations. Most notably Wolf Creek Pass. So a warmer climate is going to result in more beetles surviving the winter. It's going to result in less ability for the trees to survive beetle outbreaks. So if a tree is stressed out, it's going to have a harder time pitching out bark beetles. Bark beetles are going to be able to kill the tree, to reproduce and kill the tree and spread. And we've definitely seen that. Right now, those bark beetles have been moving from around Wolf Creek Pass west over the last 10 years or so. If you go up by Silverton, you can see it. If you go into Purgatory, you don't see it there. So I'm optimistic, hopeful, I should say, that we don't get beetles up in Purgatory, because that's going to be a huge problem for everybody involved. So, getting into what we do. There's a range of things that we do, ranging from what you hear called forest restoration or ecological restoration, all the way across the spectrum to something that would just be called forestry, classical forestry. Ecological restoration is really something we do to move forests back towards that historic range of variability. It's something that is usually associated with areas we don't have a recurring other resource to manage for. So if we're restoring an area, we're generally not talking about managing for forest processing for the long term. On the other hand, forestry, classical forestry, is usually has wood products production as sort of a fundamental goal. And so we're not really doing a whole lot of that. What we really do is a lot of this thing called ecological forestry. So we're trying to take what we know about the ecosystem and in our managed landscape, try to move our managed landscape closer to what we know about that landscape historically. And so this is a lot of what you're going to see on the San Juan and what I'm going to talk about here next. A couple examples of what we're doing. So the first one is really prescribed fire, focusing in on the Pargin landscape, east of Bayfield. This map shows all the areas that we were doing prescribed fire this fall. So mainly focusing on Ponderosa Pine and dry conifer forests. The Pargin fire is in the HD Mountains just east of Bayfield. This is approximately 6,000 acre area that had some prescribed fire in September. The goals of this were to reduce fuels, to improve habitat for deer and elk, and to just recycle nutrients in the landscape, so to unlock some of the nutrients locked up in litter and guff on the forest floor. And so as part of that process, we put black line on the ground, essentially a black perimeter, a burn perimeter, in order to protect the edges of the fire, and then in the following days, a helicopter was used to ignite on the interior. So this work was done by Chris Tuten, who's our fire management officer down on the Columbine District in Bayfield. And it's hard to overstate how much they're doing on Columbine District. Prescribed fire at the scale of 6,000 acres is something to be proud of in this state, because not a lot of people are trying to manage landscape like that in this state. So in the HD Mountains, it's really rugged. If you've been over there just east of Bayfield, it's pretty steep. There aren't very many flat places. There aren't many roads. So fires really are a tool for this landscape. Getting into the next one.
That was all one big burn you did.
One big burn this year, but there were other burns across the course of other areas this year.
But that one area was one time.
One burn.
2 or 3 times.
Yeah, and I should say one time meeting within a couple week period.
Okay.
And actually, if you head over there, you'll actually see some of that smoke still. So it's not entirely out, but it's contained in the perimeter. So what that does is it raises that crown base height, so it reduces the potential for fires to get into the tree canopies. It reduces some of those latent fuels like small trees and oak. And then what it does is it opens up some ground for grass to establish, and then for resprouting oak, which is much more palatable to deer, for browse species. It also, at times in this landscape, opens up little patches in the canopy where trees can torch out. This is a pretty blunt tool. We don't get to control all the parameters associated with managing fire, but it's really the only tool we have for managing these rugged areas that don't have any roads. And there's some negative impacts. Like the smoke is still impacting people over there, and we've had air quality alerts in the Piedra Valley due to this burn. And so it's not all rainbows and unicorns, as they say, but this is allowing us to avoid a worse situation where we had fire burning through the same landscape in June with a wind on it when the fuels are really dry. So this is really just trying to protect against a worse situation in these forests. So moving on and up into the Mixed-Conifer. This is a timber sale in the South San Juan Mountains. So this is just on the lower flanks of the mountain below the wilderness, just east of Pagosa Springs. This is in the cool, moist Mixed-Conifer. So this is a white fir, Douglas fir, and aspen forest. This is called the Blackhead Peak Timber Sale. So around 100 acres, 3 units, or 4 units, excuse me, ranging from 20 to 30 acres. And the goal of this project was to, one, produce forest products, both conifer products and aspen saw logs. It was also to regenerate young aspen, and then it was also to retain some diversity on the landscape and reduce some of the prevalence of white fir. Within this landscape, let me just get the notes here. It's not that this stand is completely outside of the historical range. It's that this landscape all has conditions similar to this. We've had small trees come into this landscape everywhere, and in this 100-acre area, we're going to try to move conditions towards younger forest conditions. And to do that in an aspen stand, you really need to open up the stand to light and remove a lot of the shade and the standing aspens. And when you do that, you get a stand of dense young aspen. And so this stand is going to grow into a future aspen stand in the next 100 years. But the goal of this was not to just create simple stands. Like, the only thing driving this project wasn't just producing saw logs, it was to create some variability in these stands. So we retained some dead trees, and we also retained some live Douglas fir. So these are trees that would be adapted to fire, have thick bark, and these are trees that might survive a fire in these forests, which come every 50 to 100 years on average. So we're really trying to manage for those conditions that we get in these forests after a fire moves through. And so moving on up to Wolf Creek Pass. So a lot of questions on Wolf Creek Pass in the Ponderosa district and on the forest, because this is where you come face to face with dead trees. This is a wet and cold place where fire is really not an issue. It's not really driving our management. It's also fairly rugged and wet. And so those are major constraints on what we're doing in these forests. The primary goal of this project was really to produce forest products. So this is more towards that forestry end of the spectrum. So in areas where we could sustainably manage the forests, we wanted to produce spruce saw logs that have a value in log home construction. One thing that a lot of folks don't know is that the spruce trees that we have on our landscape are some of the biggest and oldest trees in North America. And so they're exceptional quality for log home construction. And another associated goal is to produce, or to end up with a stand that is able to grow into a future forest. And so this is what it looks like out there. Thankfully, if you get in the woods over Wolf Creek Pass, it's not all dead. You see young green trees in the understory, and that's a product of the wetness and the productivity in that landscape. And so here's the conditions we're left with. Bunch of green trees still left, still some dead trees that are past the point where they don't have any value. We also left a lot of material on the ground, because after the beetle event, these trees would fall. Those trees are shade for young trees, and that allows for perpetuation of trees in the stand. We don't want to remove all that stuff. We also avoided areas of young trees, and then overall avoided almost 90% of this area because of water resources and just inaccessibility. We don't really have the values out there to facilitate logging on steep slopes or anything with helicopters, so that great constraint will come up there. Here's some shots of what it looks like immediately post-harvest up there, some of those logs. And so the final thoughts on this, everything that we're doing on the San Juan, we try to ground in collaboration with the community. We don't want to be promoting something on national forests that community is totally against. And that goes from the forest plan to individual projects. And then after we plan projects and collaborate on what we're trying to do, what we're really doing out there is we're practicing. Doing forestry, doing fire management. Expertise is involved, and you're always going to learn something, and you always don't know all the information you'd like to know in order to make the best decision. So you need to practice, and then you need to observe and learn. We do that internally, but then we also rely on folks at MSI, folks at Colorado State University, Northern Arizona University, Fort Lewis, to take a look at what we're doing and give us feedback so that we can learn how to do things better and then repeat the process going forward. And the end goal here is to have a community that's better knows how to manage this forest over the long term. So with that, that's all I got. Look forward to your questions. I tried to throw a lot of things you could ask questions about in there. So thanks for the opportunity.
Nice job. Cool. Thank you, Matt. We're gonna bring them back. You're gonna grill the heck out of them. We're gonna bring one additional person up here from the Colorado State Forest Service. But we want to give you a moment to stretch your legs and breathe. We'll be back here talking in 10 minutes. Bring your questions to those folks. Quick note, you guys burned 10,000 acres this year with prescribed fire. It's about right. Ish. And then there's also the cross-laminated timber industry in town now. Kyle Hansen has been building one of those.
Timber age systems?
Timber age systems. So lots of conversations are going to be had about that, and also the future conversations about carbon sequestration and all that. But you can ask them that too. So, and then Emily was holding up a sign-in sheet if you haven't signed that yet. Take a break. We'll be back in 10 and we'll give all the questions.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Hi. It's great to see you.
Tree. Henrietta, you said about 10,000 acres, right? 2 million acre forest, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's
So what is that to where pricing wasn't a problem, you had all the money you needed. And we really needed to get on this to prescribe. What would we be doing?
Yeah, I like the big
Yeah. Put them under the light, 10,000 flowers, just get them up, but boy, we got that.
Well, I can't give you an exact number.
Yeah.
I mean, it's going to be at the scale of like 20 to 40,000 acres,
Okay.
roughly. So I mean, we're getting close to where we're in that range that we need to be.
Okay, to move ahead, to get everything treated in a 2-decade time frame or something like that.
The thing about it is that, and this is where like I just can't stay away from the details, is that a lot of that area is around communities. It's mixed, so how often we would manage it, how frequently we would manage it can vary quite a bit. And so there's some complexities
Checking in.
that we need to address. The other thing that we're doing right now is follow up burns effectively. So we've really been focusing on repeat burning in some of these areas. So Argent's going to be burned again because that's well, I mean, initially we're looking at like 5 years, and then it's going to get longer, right? So one thing you see, you know, is fire. And then by the time we get back to it, so at least on Columbine, they have a strategy on these increase in areas where they're going to get it on the
They're teaching me, but I'm not very good at it.
We're definitely also getting into a situation where we're trying to manage that area heavily logged. That is now fairly large.
We'll come back together in about 5 minutes.
Prescribed by generally if you burn in clear conditions, we're not really so we're going to try to do some harvest and follow up. We have sort of the short-term issue where we can't do both. And we're actually doing things not So, at least in the next piece,
And I'm on a sliding scale.
but that'll all change, and I really do feel like we gotta do both.
No, I don't know about the. Yeah. That's what I'm hoping. That's my scheme.
The canopy gonna be still there. Shade tolerance trees would be white fir, well, English spruce is a little bit less tolerant of shade, but it's still very good shade tolerant. The other
I know how that goes.
Generally,
I know.
I don't.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think the differences are in the.
Well, this is.
I
was on the
think
wall
so.
now. See how picking up on those? Yeah.
Well, it was on
Oh, really? Yeah, and you guys, you don't use any like sort of computer, ecological models, helping you decide what to do and not what.
It's raining already.
Oh, yeah.
So I really want to drive it.
There's a one of the main.
Yes. That's tricky, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, simulators and
I got it.
potential
The last bus. Rides a lake from the airport downtown and catches a bus that goes by our house. It only goes so late, like 6.
And you made it.
And he made it. It was 90 seconds to spare. And it's like, great, so it's back to the airport.
Oh, man. I love it. It's cool he has that collection.
Yeah, actually, he's going to sell the Porsche. We're just going to sell it.
But the convertible maybe good for you.
Oh. I don't know.
It's not that you're not allowed, right? It's just
Let's be clear, I'm not allowed.
Okay, fair enough.
No.
All right, I better wrangle the crowd. All right, folks, why don't we gather around? We'll get the next stage started. Grab that plate. Go to the back. Which one? Turn the projector off, or you guys can be on the side. We're going to add one more element to this conversation here, too. I'd like you to introduce you to one of our other fantastic partners, Mark Loveall with the Colorado State Forest Service. He works down here in Durango, from here to La Veta, and the Colorado State Forest Service. So working with the U.S. Forest Service is an important partner, but when we start thinking about all the lands and the forested lands we manage here in Colorado, the State Forest Service is a big component to that. And then I do need to give props to the wildfire adapted and Charlie back there, because that private land piece is also a big component of it. So we'll introduce Mark. We're going to bring Matt Tuten back up. We'll bring Mr. Remke back up. Looks like he's getting a glass of water. But Mark, why don't you introduce what you'll be addressing, and then we'll get everybody else in.
Sure. Sarah?
Yeah.
Yeah, my name's Mark Loveall. I'm a forester with Colorado State Forest Service. And behind the table is my colleague, another forester with us, Ryan Cox. And if you guys don't know, our office is up on the Fort Lewis campus. We're kind of on the north end. So we're different than the U.S. Forest Service. We're part of Colorado State University. And our main thing that we do is working with private landowners for the most part. But we also work with counties, the city, and as well as great partners. MSI, Charlie with Wildfire Adapted, the U.S. Forest Service, local fire departments around. So we do a lot of partnering with what we do and how we manage land. We don't necessarily have our own land that we manage. We do have those state sections you might see on the map. Those actually belong to the state land board, but we do the forest management. But we do a lot of our work on private land, and we do some now more and more with the U.S. Forest Service through what we call good neighbor agreements. So we don't carry out prescribed fire operations. That's something we don't do. So we may administer projects, like I mentioned, the good neighbor projects on the U.S. Forest Service land, and we may generate slash piles through the work of the projects. But the U.S. Forest Service ultimately ends up burning those piles, not us. But we still do consider fire when we're working with private landowners, how that forest may react in a fire, what the fire history is, kind of like what Dr. Remke was talking about. So those are all the things you've heard tonight. We work with the landowners and discuss with them on how to manage their forests. So that's kind of what we do. We do a lot of different things on a lot of different lands. So feel free to ask questions, and thanks for coming out tonight.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Yeah, Mark Loveall. I will say, Mike put up that map of how we ought to think about our landscape, how we think about our communities. With Wildfire Adapted, with Colorado State Forest Service, we can take that cross-boundary, full landscape approach to making sure our communities and our resources are secure. All right, we'll bring up Matt and Mike and Mark, and let's grill them. Don't be afraid. Don't feel like you gotta be polite. These guys can handle it. We got a question here from Jeff.
Thank you for the talk. Really wonderful. I'd like to get a better understanding from a landscape trees perspective of the landscape response to mortality event, such as one that would be incurred by these problematic beetles versus a mortality plus disturbance event, such as one in the fire. Are there fundamental differences in what those landscapes look like in response to those events?
So the question is there fundamental differences in landscape response to different disturbances, one being dramatic, one offering more of a patchy kind of network kind of piece. Is that right?
And one that's brought about by a whole stand or landscape of trees that's just dying from a beetle infestation versus death incurred by forest fire, which has this huge disturbance also.
Okay.
Go ahead. Well, so it depends on what forest you're talking about, right? And a big difference between mortality that you see from fire and mortality that you see from beetle, per se, and let's just stick with beetles initially, is that beetles generally preferentially attack the biggest trees in the stand. So in your lower elevation forests, say your Ponderosa Pine, your Mixed-Conifer with Douglas fir, the bark beetles want to get into the bigger trees, and in most cases leave the smaller trees alone. We've actually seen such high levels of bark beetles that bark beetles are getting into really small trees because there's nothing left to eat. So we've actually seen that in spruce fir. I mean, you see kind of a differential effect on the bigger trees. With fire, it's going to preferentially attack the smaller, it's going to consume the smaller trees first generally, unless it's a crown fire, and then you can kind of have sort of like stand-wide mortality. It's also going to impact the soils quite a bit more. And you can actually see some really negative impacts of wildfire on soils, especially when you sort of couple a wildfire with monsoons. And I think folks in Hermosa know about that. I mean, a lot of, mass wasting and just soil ended up in the stream as a result of that disturbance. So those are some things that come to mind, at least to me. Any thoughts?
I would reiterate that, and also consider that the effect of fire might reinvigorate some of our sprouting shrubs a little bit more than a beetle that just kills our overstory trees, right? So that disturbance from fire can help our aspen and some of our sprouting species actually take off and add more cover to the landscape a little more rapidly than the beetle kill itself. That being said, after a beetle kill event, you do have a lot of windfall trees, a lot of other dynamics that come into play after that. So it's complicated, right? But I think Matt's answer addresses the main things I think about, which is tree size and soil and erosion.
Well, and then I guess like bark beetles generally affect specific trees, right? So if you have a solid type of wood forest, which we have a lot of spruce forests, a spruce beetle is going to affect spruce trees. And so if all you have is spruce, you're going to see a ton of mortality. If you have a mixed forest, you're going to see differential mortality depending on what beetle's in there affecting what tree. So like where Fir Beetles are acting, you really only see a few Douglas fir dying. And you don't always see a bunch of other tree species dying. Whereas if a big fire moves there, through there, it's going to affect everything. So I guess another way that works.
Awesome. That's right here.
Yeah, my name is Russ, and I'm kind of curious, with climate change, it sounds like we're going to see drier years. That also sounds like then we're going to see more beetle infestations, and there's going to be more impact on the forest. Am I reading that correctly? What you think is going to happen?
So the potential and prophetic, also make it available to folks who might be listening on Facebook here. Drier years, larger beetle impacts potential.
Well, yeah, Matt had talked about kind of the cycle of things. We get into kind of the circle we have. There's variable, the temperatures are going up, but yet we have these vast oscillations in precipitation patterns from year to year. You talked about the impact of that on the trees. So, we're at least when we go out and meet with the landowner, we're always looking at the possibility of, well, what's been happening? What do we think is going to happen? How can we create a forest or make somebody's forest into what we call the term resilient, that's resistant to those things that we think are going to be coming? We know this was a wet year, but a drought's probably just around the corner. We're seeing higher temperatures. If we do that, what kind of tree species should that landowner or the landscape be having on them to resist beetles, fire, that sort of thing? So, so we're kind of looking at those specific, at least I always look at those specific events. What's the possibility of those occurring? What tree species, what arrangements, that sort of thing on the landscape are going to be resistant to those things.
So the nuance I might throw into that question too is, so Wolf Creek Pass, if we focus on that geography, spruce beetle has generally attacked most of the viable host trees that spruce beetle can attack on Wolf Creek Pass. So the beetles have really moved on from that landscape. A lot of that regeneration shows almost no signs of beetle attack, right? And so right now we're moving into a phase where the beetle's moving across the landscape, it's moving out to the west. But Wolf Creek Pass is regenerating and coming up into a new forest, right? If we project out 100 years, 300 years, sure, persistent drought might be a problem yet again, and we might have prime conditions for another beetle outbreak similar to the one we're seeing right now. But in current state, it's also possible that forest is going to regenerate, have healthy trees, survive for another however long, and then experience yet another pulse disturbance event, whether that's from the beetles or from the fires, who knows, right? So it's not necessarily as simple as more drought equals more tree mortality equals widespread beetle outbreaks equals more fire. There is some nuance into where those beetles are going and how they move across the landscape.
Yeah, I mean, and just to add on to that, I mean, it's not just drought, it's hotter temperatures. So it's kind of the variability in precipitation, and then hotter temperatures in those forests, not only in the summer, but also in the winter. So I mean, if we have much milder winters, you're not gonna have extreme cold snaps killing beetles or spruce budworms like you would in a colder climate. And so you're gonna see greater survival of those insects over the winter, and greater survival means more beetles, more budworms to reproduce and leading to larger populations. We've also seen some evidence that beetles that have 2-year life cycles are now almost completing the entire life cycle in 1 year. The spruce beetle generally has a 2-year life cycle, and we've seen some examples, it seems, that we're seeing the life cycle being completed in 1 year because the season for reproducing is much longer. That's sort of some anecdotal stuff from some entomologists, but those are some ways that the impacts of temperature is almost as important as the impacts of drought.
On the most basic level, though, trees rely on that moisture that's in the system as a defense, right? It's what they transpire, it's what they carry up the trunk of the tree, and that sap, whatever's moving up and down, helps them force the beetles out. And when you have a drier climate, they don't have that same defense mechanism because they don't have the same ability through sap.
Just to stay on that topic for a minute, do the spruce budworm and the spruce bark beetle, do they ever hit at the same time, or does one precede the other, or what's the succession of those two species?
Yeah. Go for it. Well, I mean, totally. I mean, unfortunately, right? Like, you'll often see just decades at this point of just continued spruce budworm pulses, and then trees that are just kind of beaten down in the canopy or in the crowns from just repeated defoliation. And so if a tree's trying to pitch out a beetle and it doesn't have foliage, it's at a disadvantage. And definitely see that in Douglas fir, where that's a host species for spruce budworm, even though it's not spruce. And then after years of that, you see patches or stands of Douglas fir dying from bark beetles.
I will just throw out there too, we're less familiar with spruce budworm often because it doesn't leave these vast forests of gray trees like the beetle does, the bark beetle. But if you want to see spruce budworm activity, go to Purgatory this winter. Go ski at Purgatory, and as you're skiing in the spruce trees, you'll notice the branches don't come all the way to the ground in the spruce forest. A lot of that's caused by repeated defoliation by spruce budworm. So it actually makes the lake skiing at Purgatory a lot nicer than it once was. But that's a good opportunity to see spruce budworm activity and see what that repeated defoliation looks like before it's attacked by a bark beetle.
That's the plus side of climate change, right? Aspen skiing at Perth. Yeah. Go ahead in the back.
So I think this question is probably for Ryan, but since we live in the San Juan Basin, and we are in the methane hotspot, is that methane hotspot in this area causing or contributing to some of our drought that we're having year-round? I mean, just, it seems like the storms are going north of us constantly.
Yeah.
Or they're going way south, or they're not down in here.
So that's a really good question, and the answer I'm going to give you is we just don't know. The methane hotspot and the amount of research that's been done on it is bare minimal, and in particular how we've researched how that interacts with larger climate processes, no one knows. Absolutely no one knows. So who knows? That's a question for an atmospheric scientist who's trying to better understand weather patterns at large, how methane in the atmosphere is influencing those weather patterns. But there's a lot of complications with things called El Nino, which is the El Nino Southern Oscillation, and the Pacific Multi-Decadal Oscillation, and the Alaskan Decadal Oscillation. And all of these are how ocean temperatures influence atmospheric processes and are interacting with our jet stream and influencing how storms move across our landscape at large. I don't know of any publication that has directly examined the role of the methane hotspot and interplay with those processes. But those three processes I've just described are well known to have interplay with drought and weather patterns in ways that we really just don't fully understand. So atmospheric processes are complex. Methane hotspot likely has an interaction that we just don't know. I don't know if either of you gentlemen know that.
And the truth that we have several of those influences happening on our landscape as well. Dust on snow events are part of that. You know, so we're seeing some of these, and we just don't know the complete picture of what of all that is, or how it all plays out. Right here.
So I have a couple of questions. First one is you guys don't really seem to talk much about wildlife. Is that because you're looking at things on such a grander time scale? I'm curious on the short term, like during the prescribed burns where you're burning 6,000 acres, what kind of a wildlife effect does that have? That'd be my first question. And then the second question is more to Mark. I'm curious because we live in right on the edge of the Ponderosa and Pinyon-Juniper Forest, and we have a lot of pinyon-junipers and a lot of scrub oak, and it ladders to the ponderosas incredibly, and our neighbors seem their approach to fire mitigation has been to just go in, take out all the junipers and most of the pinyons and all of the scrub oak, and leave the ponderosas. And so I'm curious, I'd like to get some of your ideas about what are some healthy things to do to that forest.
So let's take those one at a time. Let's start with the wildlife for you guys.
Sure. So specifically with the prescribed fire, there will be some impacts to wildlife from prescribed fire. And an objective of that project was to improve habitat for deer and elk specifically. In fact, it was, I'm pretty sure about this, that there was actually some habitat partnership funding from the state that went into the operational costs for that burn. So there will be some short-term impacts during the burn, but the long-term trajectory for that landscape is going to be increasing the habitat value for those species specifically. So there's definitely always an interaction between the short-term and the long-term goals, but generally the long-term benefit outweighs the short-term impacts, at least on those two wildlife populations. And then we could also talk about birds, and we could talk about squirrels, and we could talk
Right, yeah, there's a lot of other wildlife habitat there. That's
So wildlife do like that mosaic, right? So part of the benefit of these prescribed fires is, we can't control them, and they end up creating a mosaic on that landscape. In some pockets they burn a little bit hotter, in some pockets they burn a little bit cooler, and that mosaic is what elk and deer really want. It gives them forage from helping recycle those nutrients. It gives them some of that fresh growth. It gives them open areas where they can go and forage, but it also leaves some more dense forests where they can hide from predators. And just an anecdotal fun thing, this year I was working some of the prescribed fires here on the San Juan, and we were dragging torch and flushed out 2 elk. So we were walking, putting fire on the landscape, and we flushed out elk who ran away from us because we were walking through the woods. And then they immediately looped back around behind us and went into the landscape that was burning, right? And so they were actually looking for little pockets that weren't burning as hot and were hanging out more in the fire perimeter than outside of the fire perimeter. So some of the short-term impacts are relatively negligible because these are organisms that are used to fire on our landscapes. So certainly, in some cases, they will run from the fire front, but in other cases, they will still hang out even in the middle of the burn.
And to segue into that, into your question, things as far as your own forest on your land, that is probably one of the more common objectives or goals that landowners present to us is that, yeah, I want to have enhanced wildlife value, whatever that is. So that's something we will take into account as we're writing a management plan for people's forests, either for hunting or wildlife viewing. For example, you talked about oak. Well, oak is a great species for turkeys, birds, bears, that sort of thing. And so we can promote large groves of oak on your property and still reduce the fire hazard by trying to get rid of the ladder fuels and the small little sprouting oak under your pines. So that's one thing, yeah, we'll definitely want to take that into account. As far as turning land into a monoculture potentially of Ponderosa Pine, I think my colleagues that agree with me, we try to get some diversity out on the landscape, mosaic. Even on a small parcel, you're going to want that. If you have one species, there's more likely if something comes through, it's going to get it. So juniper is not, it generates a lot of sparks if it catches on fire, and Charlie would attest to the fact you don't want juniper growing right next to your home. But it is more resistant generally to insects than pinyon. So you want to have that juniper component in your forest if you've got it out there. You just have to mitigate space around it. Same with the pinyon. There's a lot of value to pinyon trees as well. But when you're growing right under your pines next to your house, they need to be in the right place at the right space. So that answers your question.
Yeah.
I mean, I think part of, I'm sure when you deal with homeowners and on the natural forest, is that there really isn't just one right answer. Like the right answer is informed by what you're trying to accomplish. And a lot of times you're kind of bouncing between multiple objectives, and you've got something that doesn't quite satisfy anything, but is kind of in the sweet spot. And so, especially true when you're dealing with your own property, you get to call a lot of the shots on where this forest should go.
Alex.
Great. Thanks to all three of you for the presentations. I kind of more of a comment, and full disclosure, I work for Wildfire down in partnership with Charlie as well, over in Montezuma County.
We came this close to throwing them out.
I just had one comment on the Paradise photo and just conversation about defensible space and resilient communities. I think that picture sometimes, I mean, obviously it's really bleak looking, and it paints a picture that, you know, defensible space maybe doesn't work, but I'm here to say that it totally does work. There's a lot of scientific research behind it. The work of Jack Cohen, Dr. Jack Cohen, out of the Missoula Science Lab, kind of confirms the defensible space home ignition zone approach. A lot of those homes in Paradise, more than 50% of homes that are burned in wildfire are burned by embers and low intensity surface fire, not this crazy big super high intensity crown fire that you see in the news. And so while I totally agree, maybe we're not able to control super high intensity crown fires, there are a lot of things that homeowners can do to make the houses safer, and even in the event of extreme conditions, super high intensity wildfire, your homes can survive those wildfires. And if you're interested in that, you can talk to Charlie or I or Bill if you live in Augusta. And I just wanted to put that in there because that photo is bleak, but there's a lot that everyone can do.
And we have a great local example of that in Falls Creek.
Yeah, that's a great comment. Thank you.
So in regards to what you were just talking about, I believe it's November 8th, Netflix is doing a documentary on the campfire. So if you're a member of Netflix, you know, I think it's November 8th.
Awesome. And so just to follow up on to why I think it's really important to talk about that fire, when homeowners were told to evacuate from that fire, there was 4 known evacuation routes and homeowners had no idea which way to go. And when homeowners were trying to leave, there was flames going across the highway. The evacuation officials were saying, you have to drive through that fire. Most people had less than 20 minutes to leave their houses, right? And so when I put that photo up there and I say it can be bleak, it's to say, no matter what we do, we need to be prepared for the worst case scenario. And I'm not trying to dismiss the dispensable space concept with that. It's more to say, if you have a fire coming through our geography, even if your house is prepared, you need to know how you're getting out, and you need to be ready to get out fast, right? And so the documentary that Netflix, they actually had a PBS aired it already once, and then it's going to stay on Netflix for a while. And when you watch that documentary, the sheer chaos and panic from the homeowners is what caused so many fatalities in that fire. And so we, as a community, should consider that as how can we be prepared so that we're not standing there watching the flames fly across the highway and going, I don't know where to go. It's a great conversation. It really is. When I think about what a fire resilient community is, I think it's a fascinating conversation. And our partners at Wildfire Adaptive are critical, and State Forest Service are critical in having that conversation.
And another great partner we have is Durango Fire here in Durango and all the other fire protection districts that are out there as well. Lean heavily on them as well.
We have why don't we go to the, yes, and then we'll come back.
Question, just wondering about if you could comment on the impact of invasive plants moving into either areas where beetle kill has happened, kind of the two events that we were talking about before, either fire impacted areas, geographies, or other insect or infestation areas, and what the impact of this is. Does it make it more prone to fire, or less adaptive for the plants that, healthy forest?
So the role of invasive species and how does it influence the disturbance?
I guess also the occurrence of in what you have seen currently, and the projection of what is going to happen with invasive species, especially with the climate change that we're experiencing.
Awesome.
So it's kind of a multifactorial question.
It is. It's a good one. It's an important one.
Well, I was going to say, a lot of times you'll see after a forest thinning, and you will see invasives come in, not necessarily come in. A lot of times those seeds were there. They may respond to more sunlight on the ground. A real common one that's, I think we can all agree is a big problem, is cheatgrass. That is an invasive. It comes up early and it cures out early. And even though a lot of times it's real short, it has a lot of energy when it's dry and can really generate some crazy fire behavior. Back in my firefighting days, I've seen some cheatgrass woods really go. So that's a big one, and yeah, that's a big problem. It's not palatable by animals. It's one we want to really try to get rid of, and then there's a whole host of other species out there. But yeah, that's a big problem along homes, on our public lands, everywhere.
So the only other detail I would add to that is a lot of the presence of invasives would depend on previous land management for your geography, right? And what the seed bed is in the system you're working in. So in many cases, we have pretty healthy native seed beds, and following these disturbances, early establishing plants that are still native are the ones to come back first. If you have a seed bed of a lot of invasive species, those are going to be the ones to come back. So where cheatgrass was before, you have a disturbance, cheatgrass is thereafter, right? Of course, equipment can move seeds, cattle can move seeds, people can move seeds, wildlife can move seeds. So invasives can certainly move into a new disturbance patch, but what was happening there before probably is going to drive the presence of invasives. On the 416 fire, as an example, right after that fire, we had huge blooms of native plants called golden smoke, or Corydalis aurora, which is this beautiful post-fire, post-disturbance plant that's entirely native. And its seed bed totally came to the surface following that fire. But along trails and in areas that cattle like to hang out, we see houndstone, we see cheatgrass, we see some of the other weeds that can easily attach themselves to those cattle, get to those disturbed soil patches, and establish, right? So it's a complicated mosaic. Where is the disturbance? where are dispersal agents taking those seeds?
But some of those can be an important vector for fire in the future, post, following the disturbance. It's a good question.
And just to add, oh, sorry, go ahead, catch you off. And just, from the landowner perspective, it's one of those, just like the fire mitigation. I'm doing all I can on my property, doing the fire mitigation, I'm getting rid of the invasives, but my neighbor over there is an absentee landlord and his property's full of weeds, what do I do? And that's a tough issue to solve. A lot of times those weeds just keep coming.
Yes?
Yeah, can you just talk a little bit about what's inhibiting you from doing a better job of managing the forest? Are there laws, lack of funding, or other things that really frustrate you on a regular basis?
Matt doesn't get frustrated.
I've never seen that.
Challenges and barriers to best management practices. I think it's a great question.
Jeez. I mean, I think some degree inertia is one of the things that's kind of frustrating, in that if you haven't seen some big changes happen on the landscape, you may not be as tolerant, or you may be a little bit more skeptical of seeing more of that happen. And then it's that sort of skepticism, the intolerance of seeing some of the change, versus the potential for a really bad outcome that we know could be coming over the next few decades. And so that's kind of a frustration I deal with, in that we might be doing bigger things if we had sort of a longer track record of doing the type of work that we need to do to solve some of these problems. And of course, there's budget constraints, there's work capacity constraints that anybody in any country around the world that manages public lands has to deal with. And so that's a frustration, of course, but I can't say that it's any worse here than maybe anywhere else in the country. I don't know. What do you think, Mark? You're part of the agency.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times, financial constraints is definitely a big one. Looking like, exactly. The forest is operating on a different time scale than we're used to. It's not geologic, but it is definitely longer than our lifespans. And so, it seems like forests at times can be pretty static. And then, it is shocking when all of a sudden these big changes happen. Fire is a big disturbance that happens really quick, potentially, or beetle outbreaks. But out in the forest, even though it seems like a static forest, there's all kinds of different disturbances going on, some small, some hardly detectable under the surface. So there's a lot of different dynamics going on all the time. So sometimes it's a little hard for us humans to discern some of those.
Backwards.
Well, sort of following up on that, can you speak about a healthy forest that exists and management of a healthy forest that's a good example that you'd like to follow? Or what tools would you like to see more used?
I like that question. I'm gonna
add,
and then how do you incorporate science into that conversation too? So the question is, what's a good example? What tools do you need or could you use to do better management? And then I'm going to tag, and how do you incorporate science into that management? Apply it to your management strategies. Stack them up.
I mean, I can think of a few places that I think are very healthy. I mean, I think there's a lot of inherent resilience in our mixed conifer forests. We've seen some negative changes. We have some forest health issues like bark beetles and budworm, lots of other things out there. We've seen an increase in fuels, but I think in those forests, they're productive and wet enough and resilient that if we have fires move into them, we have species that are going to come up in a burn. So I mean, for instance, you burn a Mixed-Conifer forest, what's going to come back? A bunch of Aspen, which is a good outcome. So I mean, I think most of our Mixed-Conifer forests, while we're trending towards bad conditions, we're in pretty good shape. It's just that we are recognizing that there's a lot of potential bad outcomes becoming more and more probable due to past management, and we just really need to shift our approach in some of these over big time frames.
So if you had a do-over, what would you have done differently 100 years ago? Would you have let fires burn 100 years? I mean, some of them did.
I mean, a big thing on national forests is that a big driver of fire suppression for the last century was that we were afraid of wasting trees. I mean, we were like, we can't have these trees burn up because we might want to make houses out of them someday. And then if you look out at our landscape, there's huge areas where we're never gonna harvest a tree, and we, in our wild streams, could have never gotten to because they're just too steep and rugged. So I think if we had a do-over, it would be great to say this portion of the forest we're gonna manage for these objectives, forest products, and these other areas we're gonna manage for natural processes. And draw those lines earlier, and then work towards a landscape that facilitates us having fire on the landscape, as opposed to saying we don't want any fire on the landscape. So maybe building fuel breaks along roads on our landscape so that when we get fires, we're able to manage it. I mean, that would be my big do-over, but you know, hindsight's 20/20, particularly when you're looking at humans and forest management. So I think we're learning, and it's a multi-century process to learn how to live in the forest. I think we're making good progress.
Yeah, I'd just add there's new technologies out there for, you know, everything, harvesting to brush removal, just the use of chippers these days. But of course, there's trade-offs with that. There's places we can do fuels reduction where we don't necessarily have to have fire. Example, right around Durango, where we don't necessarily want to have prescribed fire, so we can still reduce the fuel, but it isn't quite like fire. So there's some trade-offs with some of these new technologies and new techniques as well.
So I'll just add a little bit to Aaron's point here with how do we incorporate science and try to do this with your reflection of what would you do over in the last 100 years. So when people first, Anglos and Europeans first settled in this area, we really had no idea how forests worked and how forests operated. So we thought we could go in and cut all these trees, new trees will grow back, that's the natural cycle. And by cutting the trees, we were just one step ahead of the game of losing them from fire, losing them from other disturbances. But now we know Ponderosa Pine, for example, needs bare mineral soil to grow back. If you don't have a fire, it's pretty hard to create bare mineral soil. We also know Ponderosa Pine generates seed in pulses, not continuously over its time. So if you harvest a bunch of trees and there's no seed bed, well, you're not going to have trees come back, right? And so a lot of what we've learned in the past 100 years, what I hear some people say forest mismanagement is actually forest ecology is really complicated, right? And so the actions that they did 100 years ago, they just didn't have the information that we have available today about how forested ecosystems work. Cool, they made some big mistakes, right? Today, we're doing things pretty differently than we did 100 years ago, and I can guarantee you in 100 years, we're going to have a whole new body of knowledge, and we're going to look back on what we're doing today and say, what were we thinking 100 years ago? We're going to make mistakes, and I think Matt did a really good job of articulating, like, we are constantly learning, right? So today, when we do some sort of action on the forest, it's really important to make sure that we have numbers to understand how that action influenced the future forest. And that means 1 year after that action, 5 years after that action, 10 years after that action, right? Same thing with our natural disturbance events. If we don't understand how forests are regenerating, we can't assume that we know. So Missionary Ridge is a great example that Matt pointed out. That landscape will probably never look how it did pre-missionary ridge fire in our lifetimes, and I have data to suggest that's probably true, that the Forest Service and partners at Fort Lewis College collected, right? So now when we're doing science on the 416 fire, that can help us understand what that regeneration pulse would look like and what that reforestation pulse will look like. We need to constantly update how we see the landscape, use those numbers to inform us, like, well, there's no Ponderosa Pine on the 416 fire or on the Missionary Ridge fire. What do we do about that? And that can help guide us to say, should we try planting Ponderosa Pine out there and see what happens? Maybe we do that and we find Ponderosa Pine dies, doesn't grow. So then we can maybe try something else and continually see if we have the numbers to support if our objectives were met or not. But it's a constant and complicated process.
I'll tag on one thing to that. Go back in 100 years ago, nobody would have guessed at the population growth that we've seen. Nobody would have guessed at the densities. We've seen those populations move into the wildland-urban interface. And we have a real opportunity now to start thinking about that and projecting into the future. There's a large portion of Colorado's wildland-urban interface that hasn't been developed yet. And so we as communities need to start mapping out then how do we interact with the forest and how do we as a community, how do we structure how we're going to live in these fire-prone areas. And I think that's part of what we were up there earlier with how, you know, the buffers around our communities. And that's definitely something we have to incorporate into our future thinking.
And as Alex pointed out, there's a lot of science behind how those types of treatments around homes can influence fire in our immediate vicinity. So we're using science to even understand what happens around our house when we interact with the forest and we have some sort of pulse disturbance like fire come through.
And to Alex's point too, we call it wildland-urban interface. It makes it sound like there's this band where homes come up, they stop, forest starts, right? And it's really, we live in these wildland or wildfire influenced areas. The spark carry, they go much further than just that boundary that we like to draw on the
The best way I've heard it said is that wildland urban interface in the location is a set of circumstances.
Yep. I think that's awesome. We have one more question and then I think we'll have to close it out tonight.
You guys feel generally optimistic about social collaborative efforts on larger landscape scale?
So the question is, do we feel generally optimistic about collaboration on larger landscape scale management? That's a good one.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I think in that response, right, it's like, I do feel optimistic, and I think I've seen it work in places. And then, in considering the alternative, a lack of collaboration. Would you rather have an agency or a landowner, a big landowner, or the university calling all the shots and not being able to have say in the process? So I mean, that alternative is definitely not satisfying, and I do think we make more progress in managing public lands when we take the time to get input from all the stakeholders to get solutions that the majority can agree on, instead of spending time on disagreement. And it's complicated, it seems like it's not efficient, but I don't really think there's any alternative that's more effective. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I mean, I feel optimistic because we have 3 different perspectives sitting at this table right now, each of us considered experts, but each of us with a very different lens. And all of you are here also helping us think about things that reflect the community concern. And then all of us go to various collaborative meetings where we have a bunch of stakeholders in the room with a bunch of different perspectives. And I'm constantly evolving how I think about things, and I'm sure both of my colleagues here feel similar. And watching that process happen just reiterates what Matt stated, in that we're progressing and evolving how we actually take action.
You want to add anything to that, Mark?
No, I agree completely with what was said there, and yeah, and just from our state forest service perspective, We're charged legislatively with helping the private landowners in the state, so that's a big part of what we do. But we realize the landscape, yeah, the borders and the ownership, a lot of that's, well, it's a human construct. The forests are similar across those borders. And so to actually get good forest management, you can't just stop at fences. We need to be moving across larger landscapes. So that's the only way. Sure, we can work with you on your forest, but if we're working with you and your neighbors, we're doing things much more effective.
I would add, I think it's essential, and I think it's because otherwise we're operating in a shotgun patchwork approach, and we're not actually addressing it on a landscape scale unless we're working together.
So just one related question to that, if we could. Of course, you're looking out many decades and even centuries, in terms of the marches and such and stuff. And what the increase in due to climate, the increase in the heat and the changes in the moisture and heat regimes, there's a latitudinal long-term effect going on, as well as elevational. So do you do any assisted migration? Because if you wait through a life cycle of a tree, a squirrel carries off a plant at 20 feet out, and then that has to grow to a tree. And do you actually take some and say, we know this is moving north here, and so we're going to take some seeds and help it migrate to where it wants to go because that forest habitat type is shifting?
That's an excellent question. Matt, you want to talk about the ask?
Well, so on the San Juan National Forest, Ghost Springs, we have a study with Colorado State University and Rocky Mountain Research Station, part of a national network, to look at silviculture strategies, forestry strategies for adapting our mixed-conifer forests to a changing climate. And we're looking at different levels of and intensities of treatments to adapt that local forest to expected changes. And that includes managing for more fire-adapted species in some stands. That includes managing for more, much less trees on the landscape, almost more savanna-like conditions. And then that's part of a national network of similar sites in which, in other sites, they're actually looking at assisted migration. We're not really doing that here. So we do have that, and then Mike apparently did this for his graduate work, so he has something to say on that.
I'll just say Canada's been really aggressive in understanding and applying assisted migration in the forested ecosystems and monitoring what's happening. So they've been moving birch in an assisted migration fashion and studying the heck out of it, right? My dissertation had a very rigorous assisted migration component to it, and I don't really want to dive into that right now. We could be here for another while, but I will say that there's a lot of science that needs to be done in that, and there's a lot of concerns, including outbreeding depression and introducing new gene pools to new environments in cases where you're assisting a certain genotype as opposed to a species to an entire new environment. There's also potential consequences of moving a species into an environment that it wasn't before, and we don't fully understand that. There's also barriers to success, including different soil types, including things that are more complicated than just what's the climate envelope and are you moving it into an appropriate climate envelope. So while that could be a tool, we really need to understand that tool before we start using it. We have not refined it into a hammer just quite yet. We have a lot of work ahead of us to fully understand that. But people are doing the good research. There's folks from across the country, and especially in Canada, trying to understand that as a tool, trying to refine it into something that we can add it to our toolkit.
Very good answers. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for this evening. We very much appreciate you being here. Thank you to our partners, to all San Juan Citizens Alliance, Colorado State Forest Service, Southern Rockies Fire Science Network, and then of course all the staff from Mountain Studies Institute. Thank you all very much, and have a wonderful evening and a safe drive home.